This is Toki's story, as told through my perspective as her caregiver, Marcia. Tokite was captured in the waters of Penn Cove, Washington, on Whidbey Island on August 8, 1970. She was 4 years old. Her extended family of approximately 80 orcas were herded into a netted-off section of the cove using speedboats, explosives, and aircraft. Records indicate that 8 young orcas were captured that day and sold off to marine parks, namely SeaWorld. One of those marine parks was Toki's final destination, the Miami Seaquarium. There are anecdotal reports that several young orcas drowned in the nets that day and were hidden from view by sinking their bodies with rocks or anchors. These captures represent the very darkest days in the marine history of the Pacific Northwest and were the basis of extreme public outcry calling for the end of this practice, which finally happened in 1976. Tokite was then taken to the Seattle Marine Aquarium with several other young whales to await being shipped off to marine parks, including SeaWorld, and this is where she was given the name Tokite when chosen by the then veterinarian at Miami Seaquarium, Dr. Jesse White. She arrived at the Miami Seaquarium on September 14, 1970, and was placed in the world's smallest orca tank, the Whale Bowl. She joined the young orca Hugo, also a captured southern resident, who was taken from Vaughan Bay in 1968. There was a lot of press at the time calling her, quote, Lolita, Hugo's bride. Hugo and Lolita were most likely either cousins or siblings, having been taken from the same pod, L pod. Hugo died 10 years later of a brain aneurysm after reportedly banging his head against the sides of the concrete. His body was removed via crane, and he was taken by truck to the Miami landfill. There was very little mention of him after that. Tokite was then alone until 2 Pacific white-sided dolphins were brought in to share the pool with her. I met Toki in 1988, and at that time she had been there for 18 years. Toki and I were about the same age, as her approximate birth year was 1965, and mine is 1964. When I first met her face to face, I felt a powerful connection to her, a feeling that I was supposed to be with her. I was supposed to take care of her and support her. I was hired at the park as a flipper trainer, a silly show involving 5 bottlenose dolphins called Flipper's Beach Party. I remember spending as much time as I possibly could at the whale area, helping, washing buckets, watching shows, and then working with the dolphins there. Honestly, anything I could do to be helpful and noticed, which paid off, as not long after I started, an opening came up on the whale team and I was offered a position. I couldn't believe I got to spend my days with this absolutely amazing marine mammal. She was very special to me. Toki had a lot of trainers and pool mates come and go over the years, and it seemed that the only constant was her. Through all of that change and loss, she was always resilient. What struck me the most is that despite her conditions, she seemed to have found a way to be positive, be joyful, foster relationships, and be present. She had a wonderful sense of humor. She bonded with her caregivers and showed real affection. She loved to play and be given attention. It was clear to me that she knew she was the star of the show. When she did an athletic jump and splashed the children in the splash zone, she would watch their reaction and seemed to enjoy seeing them jumping up and down with delight. She could feel their energy, and I believe she knew she was deeply loved. A debate began to rage in the late 80s and 90s about efforts to liberate her and bring her back to the Salish Sea, where her family still swims. I was secretly all for hearing those plans, but in my position, I couldn't possibly let my feelings be known. I would have been fired immediately. I also knew that the Miami Seaquarium's position was firm. They would never sell her or let her go. The basis for their position did have some merits, some being that during her time in captivity, she had likely been exposed to various bacteria and viruses that could potentially sicken or kill her extended family back in the cold waters around Puget Sound. Other arguments were that she had lost her natural instincts to hunt, communicate, and survive on her own, and it was unclear if her family would even recognize her after so many years. I agreed then that simply freeing her to the sea was irresponsible and it would put her at great risk. An option I heard a few times was to create a pen or enclosure in a protective cove, but I never saw any actual places or plans for that. The debate raged on for over a decade, with animal rights groups protesting nearly every weekend out in the parking lot and requesting meetings with the owners of this aquarium. The answer from the then owner, Arthur Hertz of Wometco Enterprises, was a deafening no every time, and eventually their requests were basically ignored. The protests continued, Toki kept doing shows, and I eventually left the park when a management change made it impossible for me to continue there. I was basically forced out. It broke my heart to leave her, and I thought about her every day. In November 2005, the southern resident orcas were finally officially listed as endangered under the Federal Endangered Species Act, the ESA, by the National Marine Fisheries Service, NIPS. I somehow thought that this would also protect Tokite, but nothing changed for her. Because she was in captivity, she was basically exempt from any of these protections. Then one day, the Lummi Nation of Washington State became involved in and around 2018 when a totem pole was traveled from Washington State to Florida to raise awareness about Toki. The Lummi's position was that they considered Tokite their, quote, relative beneath the waves, and they wanted their relative back where she belonged. The effort began to pick up steam when a collaboration between the Lummi Nation, the founders of the Whale Sanctuary Project, and a wealthy benefactor, Pritam Singh, began. A group called Friends of Toki, originally Friends of Lolita, was formed, of which I became a part in April of 2023. And a plan to increase Toki's water quality, food, care, and eventually create a sanctuary began in earnest. The plan grew wings when a billionaire football team owner and philanthropist, Jim Irsay, announced his pledge to finance the entire project, from her daily care, transport, sea pen enclosure construction, to her long-term care at the planned sanctuary at Cypress Island in the Salish Sea. Tokite had always been a very healthy whale for as long as I knew her, and according to her records, which I read through before my time with her, she had not been sick at all, other than just menses symptoms. And this was the case until a lung infection that occurred in 2022 had caused her to become quite ill. She nearly lost her life. She was tended to by Miami Seaquarium vets, as well as a team of outside vets who put her on a very specialized antibiotic drug that was sourced from Japan. Right around this time, she was retired from performing and removed from all guest viewing. The stadium where she lived was condemned by the county as well due to crumbling concrete and structural failures. I believe that retiring her and removing all of the adoring crowds and energy really affected her in a negative way. It was all she knew. Now suddenly, after 53 years of performing for cheering crowds, high energy, and people visiting all day, the stadium went silent. In the 53 years she lived at the Miami Seaquarium, generations of visitors grew up with her and loved her deeply. Toki's behavior changed dramatically when we, Friends of Toki, arrived in the early spring of 2023. She began to exercise a lot more on her own, doing fast swims, breaches, and jumps. She began to initiate play with her caregivers and participate in enrichment, including a really fun cognition communication board that I created for her. Despite all the positives, it was a terrifying time. Maintaining her health and our plans to get her out of that pool and crumbling stadium as soon as possible were my only thoughts. Everything seemed to be on track until the day in mid-August when Tokite suddenly refused food, and it was a shock to all of us. She had always had a very good appetite, and we had recently increased her food quality. The salmon and herring she was being given was high restaurant quality fish. Her tragic death only 2 days later was absolutely devastating. and completely unexpected. Tokite should have never been captured by humans. She should have lived her life in the wild with her family in the Salish Sea. She should have been a mother who raised her children in the sea and taught them the ways of the mighty orca. But she was captured, and she lived a life of captivity for people. We can't change the past, but bringing her home could have possibly healed some of the wounds created by those captures and her years away from her family. She deserved to go to her sanctuary, and I would have been by her side. I believed 100% that it was her destiny to go back to her home waters. After everything she'd been through, she earned the right to live in peace in the waters of her ancestors, where she was born.